Hello and welcome to all my .NET Nuclear YouTube subscribers and Twitter followers. This is Scott Wilkinson. I know it's been a while since I put out a video. I have been working hard since my last video on my consulting business, but I have been developing training materials. But what I've been developing them for is the Southern Fried .NET and Day of .NET Conference that was on last week, actually on April 13th and 14th. And so what I'm going to do now is take all that training material that I did for the conference and put it into YouTube format so that all my subscribers and everyone else in the community has the benefit of seeing the training if you didn't have a chance to attend the event in Charlotte. Now this class was the Module Programming 101 class that I did on the training day, which is on the Friday of the event. This class was a 6-hour course, basically an all-day course, and it took you through .NET module development from beginning to the end. Now I know I already have some entry-level and beginning demonstration videos on DNN development, but the good thing about this video is, number one, it is updated for .NET 7. I know there's been some comments on my videos asking about that since the videos I have out there were for DNN 6. So even for you guys that have seen my other videos, there will be some of this will be review for you, but some of it will be new. I'll be showing you some of the UI guidelines, the EVS package testing service, the DAL2 data layer, which is the big new update for DNN 7, as well as the new DNN 7 development templates. So before I go through all the PowerPoint slides, let me first show you what we built for this class. So the theme of the training session was it's a Southern Fried chicken restaurant, fried chicken restaurant, and the theme for the Programming 101 class was to build the menu module for that Southern Fried website. So let me just show you the end result here. This is the module. It's a menu module. Obviously, it shows a listing of menu items for the restaurant. Each menu item has a picture, a title, a description, a price, and it could have either two indicators, whether or not it's vegetarian and whether or not it's featured or recommended. In the so that's your view right there. We also set up an edit control where you can edit or add an item. We actually set up the add item action. We can also delete, and there's one setting for changing the locale of the currency locale for the pricing. So that is the module that we built by the end of the class. So going back to the slideshow, the first thing what we had to do to develop the module was, of course, install .NET. So we went out and installed the DNN install package, not the source, just the install package for the latest version of DNN 7. Put it on a folder on our hard drive, made sure we give full permissions to that folder, to ourselves and to the network service. The only reason I give it to myself is for Windows 7, so it doesn't prompt me for admin rights. We created an empty database. We had virtual machines that had, I think they were Windows Server 2012 with SQL Server 2012, but either 2008 or 2012 would work. We created an IIS application and pool. Those servers had IIS on them. I know in my previous videos I've leaned toward using like the IIS Express web matrix because it's easier to get it up and running. But we're using IIS for a couple reasons. Number one is it's already on the machine, and it's common to use IIS because if you're testing your module on like more interesting portal type setups like a child portal, things like that, you'll need IIS. The other reason is because the new template that Chris Hammond put out there, by default is configured to expect the URL of dnndev.me and port 80 as your default project URL, and it's easier to just set that up. Basically what you do is after you create your IIS application and pool, you just add a host header to that application, which is dnndev.me port 80, and when you install the template, everything's going to work right out of the box. So once we did that, of course, browse to the site. It should, if everything's configured right, redirect you to the install.aspx, which takes you through the install process. In DNN 7, obviously, it's a new install process that's like a single page, much more simplified. Basically, set up your database information, and off you go. It should finish creating the website, and we're on to our next task. So after the DNN site is installed and we can see it's fully functioning, now we're ready to get ready for development. So the first thing we had to do was to download our module development template. And just like in my previous sessions, we're going to use the christalktemplate.coplex.com, the Chris Hammond's templates. He's got new updated templates for .NETNuke 7. So download the latest one, and in this case we downloaded the DNN7 DAL2. It's in a V6 installer. What that is it basically it's a zip file, but it's using the extension V6. But in Visual Studio 2012, which is what we're using, if you download that and double click on a V6 file, it'll automatically install it. It's really easy. If you want to verify it's installed, after you get the message that it's done installing, open Visual Studio 2012. I think it's Tools and Extensions and Updates, and then you can see that the template's in there. And of course, for older versions, you can follow my previous instructions in my video. Basically, just copy down the zip file that if you're using older versions like 2010, and install it in the appropriate templates, project templates folder. So after we've got our template installed, now we're ready to create our Visual Studio project. Again, this is review for all the folks that have been following my video series. Open Visual Studio, click on New Project. In this case, we named our project Restaurant Menu because we're building that menu module. We browse to our Desktop Modules folder in our DNN7 installation. That's the folder we want to install it in. We want to pick the DNN, and for our training we use the .NETNuke 7 C# DAL2 compiled module template, and made sure that we unchecked the create directory for solution. Okay, next we built our module in release mode, and this was for the purpose of initiating the build scripts, which, just like on previous versions of the module template, the MS build tasks for building our packages for our module are all kicked off from release mode builds. So we did that. I explained to the class how that worked. You guys who have followed my videos, that's just how we did it. I explained also the references that you need when you're creating a .NETNuke module, and of course the .NETNuke.dll, which is the core assembly, .NETNuke.web.client, which contains the client resource manager. I believe that's new stuff that I'm going to be discussing in this video. .NETNuke web utility has some client API and browser capability things. I don't know if all these are referenced in the template by default, but you might want to check those on your own. So just like in previous videos, I talked about the quickest way to register our module in .NETNuke is to just use the source package that was built when we kicked off the release build. I think the difference in this new module for DNN7 that I noticed is, I believe in the previous version it created the actual packages for our install and source in the a packages folder in the module project folder. Now I believe there's still a packages folder, but I think it just contains some some references and things, or just some dependencies. Now it builds it into a folder called install that's in our project root. So so what we did was we went back to our .NETNuke in the browser. We logged in, we went to host extensions, we installed the source package source package that was built for our module, which then would register our module in DNN7 and allowed us to then drag our module onto a test page and start playing around with it. One thing that's also new in the Chris Hammond modules is he built a lot of sample source code, so which is a great start for building a module, like a sample view which shows the edit and delete and a listing of items, you know, the sample data structure, the sample DAL layer. So a lot of code's been pre-built, so which was nice because we can kind of see that and then make changes to it. So the components of our module, a lot of this is review as well. I discussed this in class, which I demonstrated. Well, first of all, we created a page for our module. We dropped it on there, and then I kind of discussed it from the front end: the view, the edit, the settings. Then I went back to the code and discussed, you know, some of those base classes that we need to inherit from in the DNN core to make those view, edit, and settings work. Mainly being the portal module base and the module settings base. For more information on that, I went into more details in my previous videos, so you can always check that out. Or just kind of look at the code that I give to you in my blog article that's on my website for this video. Also discussed iActionable, which is an interface that we inherited in our view, which allowed us to create that add action on our menu. And I discussed a little bit about the DNN controller. We didn't do a whole lot of this because that's more advanced topics, but how we have that controller class in our components folder that's kind of set aside as our main controller that DNN core knows about our module. If we implement certain interfaces, for example, iSearchable to implement searching, registering keywords into the main core search from our module, iUpgradable, which kicks off certain custom events when our module is installed, and iPortable, which allows our module to kick off certain export features, so that if you wanted to export the contents of your module and then re-import it into another page, you could do that and implement that in your module. Next, we discuss the database scripts, and this is nothing new in DNN7. Our scripts are all in the same place. We have to provide a SQL data provider script that's versioned and an uninstalled SQL data provider script. As you guys know, the SQL data provider script has your creates and alters depending on what order they're running in the versioning. Your uninstall will typically have the drop tables. And I went over with the class again, like the database owner and object qualifier tokens, which we need to support in our database scripts. And I also show a little visual here on the slide of the installation where the user would actually enter those the values for those tokens in. They're optional, but that's where the user could enter them in when configuring their DNN install in the installation. And we just need to make sure as module developers that we use those tokens in our scripts so we can support that functionality. Which takes us now to the DAL2 data layer. And since this is a brand new topic in DNN7, I've never covered it before in any of my videos, I'm going to go into a little more detail in this video on this. So let's switch over to our code view, and I'll explain a little bit about the DAL2 data layer. The DAL2 layer really, well, it's a wrap in the DNN core. They wrapped some classes around a micro ORM called Petapoco, and so we'll basically be using a couple namespaces in the core. The two main components of the DAL2 data layer is one is your model and one is your I call it the repository, but it's really, or some places they call it the controller. It's really your CRUD operations, a class that contains all the create and read and update methods that are specifically for your model. So in our restaurant module here, the data item or our model is going to be called restaurant menu item. So in our components folder, we created, or actually I think we renamed what was already in there. I think in the template it was like item, just item.cs. So our model is called restaurant menu item, and we created a corresponding table called restaurant menu item. And the nice thing about this, for simple data structures where you're mapping pretty much a table to a class, you can do that all by using annotations on the class, and then the data layer, the DAL2 layer, figures out how to basically map those fields to your table. So the basis of this is, in your model, you would start out by including this using statement for the .NETNuke component model.data annotations. We'll create a class called restaurant menu item. We also created a table called restaurant menu item. It could have been named differently, but what we did was we used this annotation to say this class, this model class, correlates to this table. And we also set up some other annotations to give it the data layer indications of what our primary key is. So in our table we created an int field that's the menu item ID, and it's an auto increment, and we specify that here. This tells the data layer, hey, when you're inserting, don't insert this column because it's an auto increment. What's also great about this data layer is it contains caching inherently in it, so we don't have to do any additional work to cache our stuff. In a lot of my previous videos, I use entity framework, but I also have to, in my entity framework, kind of my repository classes, I also have to implement the DNN caching as part of that. Well, here I no longer have to do it. I can set an annotation on my model which will tell the data layer how I want caching done. In this case, I set it up to do I think it's 20. I think that's in seconds or minutes. I can't remember. I'm thinking that's in minutes. So that's a 20-minute cache on this object. And then the scope is kind of like a scope field is kind of like a common. Think of it like an index type field that you would use on a table, where it's a common kind of a common field that we would query on, like in our where clause. So basically, then all the setup is to map to create an attribute, a public attribute for every every field in the table. So we're basically mapping fields in the table to these public attributes. And again, they're in the format of a plain old C# object, a POCO. So that's kind of how it works. So make sure you're defining them in the proper way with the getter and setter, even though it's empty. Another nice convention to use is if we actually have a mismatch between what the person creating our table, like if you have a DBA creating your schema, who's separate from your developer, and he decided to name the column in the table DESC, but we wanted to use the nice full term in our class, which is description. We can handle those mismatches by adding an attribute to say that the column name for this attribute is actually DESC. Otherwise, if you don't have that, it's just going to assume the name of the attribute matches exactly with the name of the column in the table. And one other thing, no, I guess that's pretty much it. So I basically went over how to develop our model. Let me go back to my slideshow and see if there's anything else. Yeah, so again, the data annotations we have to use, and the column name attribute if we want to have mismatches. The other one I didn't really use in this demo, but if you actually have an attribute on your model that you don't want to map to a table column, like say it's a computed or derived type of an attribute that doesn't have a representative column in the table, then you can just decorate it with the ignore column and it will handle it just fine. So let's go, now my email is popping up here. Let's go to the next slide, which is the DAL2 controller. In the template, I believe Chris uses the term controller. I don't like to use controller. It's a little overused, although I guess it's somewhat used in the API of the .NETNuke core. But I like to use the term repository, so I have everyone in our class name the repository class restaurant menu item repository, I believe it was. And we're going to base that on .NETNuke.data, which is a new API in the .NETNuke core. And we're going to, it's basically going to contain our CRUD operations, like methods for creating, deleting, updating, and getting our items. So quickly, I'll just go over to our code here, and you can see it's called Restaurant Menu Item Repository. Again, using .NETNuke.data. And we're implementing basically, all the DAL2 basic methods. Just follow the template. All these are defined in the template, so all we did was really make changes to the template. So one thing to note is in this template here, since we're passing in our model data. So in the create item, we're passing in our model, and we're passing our model as well into this as a generic into the base get repository method. So yeah, we just basically use what was actually defined in the template, which is a great starting point. You got your delete, two different types of deletes: delete based on the model being passed in, or based on the item ID. We got different types of get functions. One is get items by module ID, which is a very common way to do things. You don't have to do it that way, but very commonly in your modules, your module ID will represent a grouping of items that you want to pass back by module ID. Or here's a single get item, which is by item ID. And and then an update item. So again, we basically didn't do a whole lot of code change here, other than changing the class name that from our when we renamed our model. But everything else is just the way it is in the template. So after we've defined our data layer, the next thing is to start defining our user controls. And the first one I picked to go over was the edit, what I call the edit view, rather than starting with the view, because the view is useless until we can actually add records into our database. So we started with the edit view. Again, all the pre-built code that was in the template, we kind of used that. The edit view allows us to tie, it allows users to edit the data of our module, but it's tied in with the edit permissions that's on the module and page. And our edit view allows users to both add and update a menu item. So it's dual purpose. And one of the new things I did in here that I haven't done before was I used the DNN file picker control to do the uploading of the picture. And so that's kind of new. I'm not going to go over it here, but certainly when you download the source code, you have a good example of that for your project. I also I heavily use the DNN form item classes and just the HTML constructs using the label and form item to make a consistent form UI that looks like all other forms in .NETNuke. So after we did the coding for the edit control, what I did with the class then is I took a little break to discuss debugging. And, as you can imagine, when we were starting to make code changes to the template, changing class names and different things like that, we actually created some compile errors in our code. So we went through and figured out, okay, in the view, what changed. We'll comment some stuff out to fix later. But we got it all. We got our edit done. We got it all to build. But the next thing I wanted to discuss with the students is how do you debug a module? And I covered this in detail in my previous videos, so if you want to refer back to those, you could do that. But the basics of it is you build your module in debug mode, which should overwrite the DLL in the .NETNuke bin folder with the debug version of that DLL. And then what you'll do is in Visual Studio, you'll attach a you'll go to debug, attach to process. If you're using IIS as your to host your site, you'll attach to the W3WP process. In my previous videos and what I've shown in my demonstrations using Web Matrix is, since it uses IIS Express, the process name is IIS Express. So you just set your breakpoints and you refresh your browser with your module on the page and make sure you attach to the process, and you should be able to hit your breakpoints and start debugging. Another big topic that I felt it was important for my students to understand before, diving into the, coding their views was some of the constructs around scripts and HTML and design guidelines. One of the big ones that's fairly new, but actually it's not that new, I think it started in 6.1, was the use of the Client Resource Manager. And this is what I've been implementing in all of my modules to make sure that I conform to the latest and greatest of the core API functions with my modules. So the Client Resource Manager, I have an illustration on this slide. This is actually a panel in the, I believe it's the host, I think it's in the host site settings, and it's in one of those tabs there. You can search around for it. But basically the Client Resource Manager is built into .NETNuke, and it allows for administrators of a DNN site to specify whether they want to use composite script or CSS files. What that means is basically if you check enable composite files and modules that are on the page as well as the skin itself are registering their scripts and style sheets in the Client Resource Manager, then the framework will actually take those and compile them into one file, like one JavaScript file or one CSS file, and just put on the page a registration of just that one file. I think it's using like a handler to do that. And you could also, in addition to composing files automatically, you can also specify to minify the CSS or JavaScript so that you as a module developer can be using, like, for example, a jQuery plugin, and it's the full, scripted version that you can use in development. And while you're not, while you don't have the minification turned on, you can actually debug the JavaScript much easier. And then once it's ready for prime time, you can just set it to minify using the admin settings of your module, or of the framework. So that's a really cool feature. But it only works if you, as the module developer, are registering your style sheets and scripts properly. So if you don't do it, you're not participating in that function, and people that buy your module and expect it to do that will be annoyed by you. So that's why I've been using it in all my new skins and all my new modules. And so the way you do this, I'll go over to the code. Well, one way you could do it, there's actually two ways. You could do it by using the API directly, and you can see I'm actually showing you the code view of my code behind of my view ASCX. I have a page pre-render event in which I'm calling the Client Resource Manager register style sheet. So what I do is I call a register style sheet, I pass it a reference to the page, and I also pass it the full path of my CSS, which would be the way I organize it in my modules is create a resources folder with a CSS folder and put all my style sheets in there. I'm also using this attribute of the base class control path to build that path out so that I don't need to, it builds it out correctly with a nice, reference to it. The other way to do it, and I can't really show you here, but I do this in my skins mostly, and you can also do it in your modules, is there's an actual a tag for it that you could actually add it as a tag in your ASCX, which is probably more flexible because you can change that without having to change the code. I do that in my skins because there's also an attribute on the tag which basically just says find my root skin path, which is great because it figures out what that relative path is for me and I don't have to worry about it. So again, using it in the API here or in the code here or as a gator tag on the ASCX, either way, make sure you use it, because if you don't, you're going to be left behind. The other convention I thought was really important for my students to understand is this UI guidelines. I kind of touched on this earlier with my forms in my edit, where I'm using those certain classes and the labels to give it that very consistent form look that all other forms in DotNetNuke, like in the core, give it that consistent look. A very helpful site to go to is uxguide.dotnetnuke.com. They give you lots of examples, even HTML examples to paste into your code. And this will give, again, it'll give your module that consistent user interface look for DNN. All those common class names. The website right now, I think, hasn't been updated since 6. But if you use those class names, a lot of times it'll translate really well into DNN7, the new styling of DNN7. So I've noticed that my modules, just by using those class names installed in DNN7, okay, the black tabs turn into blue or whatever the change to the look was, and it all just worked real well. It's not just on form elements and on labels, but also they got tabs, tooltips, alerts, confirm messages, all that stuff. Just make sure you go there when you're designing your UI and conform to those conventions, and the look of your module will actually get graduated as it gets installed on newer versions, if everything's done right. Now let's get back to the coding. So we did a little breakout session in the class here where I had the students just kind of build their own view however they wanted to, and I tried not to let them use their creativity and their coding skills to build this out. But basically the view is the user control that is marked in the DNN manifest as a view. A view type of user control implements inherits from portal module base. It is a view type control is a control that users can see without having edit permissions. So that's really the definer between view and edit type controls in the manifest is view type controls. This still can be data entry type things, but they're the type that you don't need edit permissions in the module or page settings. And again, I'm using the Client Resource Manager to register all my CSS and scripts. We're also implementing iActionable to add add item in the action menu, so that it appears in that context menu on the view. Then we moved on to implementing our settings. Again, as a review, a settings view is a user control that implements module settings base. It's actually an edit type control in the manifest. I'm not sure why, but that's just the way they did it. But it's a special type of view in that it gets embedded in the module settings panel in the basic DNN module settings. So we really have no control of it as far as like loading and saving and that kind of things. So when you implement the module settings base, or you inherit from that, you have to implement two methods: load settings and update settings. And this just does what you think it might do. Load settings is where you put your code to recall the settings. In other words, get the settings out of the dictionary and apply them to whatever fields that you have. And then update settings is the reverse of that. Apply the changes in the fields of your form to the settings dictionary. And of course, the settings is not, you don't have to build any data access layer around settings. It comes with it in DNN. So you basically using that settings dictionary that's in the core that's specific for your module allows you to save the settings as name value pairs in that dictionary. So after finishing all of our code, the next thing we had to discuss was how to do error handling properly in DotNetNuke. And at a 101 level, basically all I wanted to show everybody was using the DotNetNuke services exceptions API methods so that we register any exceptions. We're registering them in the event, what is it called? Event viewer, I guess it is, the admin event viewer. That way, if an exception ever does occur on their module, at least the administrators of the website can see it and, make support a little bit easier. what I typically do is in any of the events in my view controls, or sorry, any of my controls, right? Any of my views, I use the exceptions.process module load exception. So in the try catch, anywhere in my module events. And then anywhere else in my code, like maybe it's my business layer, my data access layer, I'll use the exceptions.log exception and just pass the exception from my catch into there. That'll log it as just a general exception in the event viewer, but but basically we have to conform to this in order for our exceptions to do something in a consistent way in the DotNetNuke framework. So after exception handling, we're pretty much done with our coding. Now we're kind of going back to talking about our packaging. And in particular, the DNN manifest file. The DNN manifest file is just an XML file that represents all the information that you see when you're installing the file, or when you're looking at the when you edit the extension in that host extensions view. And looking at the module definition, all this information just comes from the DNN manifest. So we talked about some of the most important items on there. The core version is very important. That core version attribute will set a minimum level. So when the user is trying to install your module, if whatever the current version of their DNN instance is, if it's less than this core version definition in this manifest, it'll stop them from even installing the module. Some other things is the resource file, which is a very good shorthand. You basically zip up the resource file, which is all of your ASCX, JavaScript, images, whatever else, all your web resources. You zip them all up, and then unzip. The installer knows to unzip them in the kind of structure that it is in the zip file. It's a real good shorthand, because back in the DNN 3 or 4 days, we had in the manifest we had to define every single file, like images, everything, manually in that XML. And so the resource file just here it is. Here are all your files that are other than your assembly and your SQL scripts. This is all the files we're going to unzip into your module folder. And then, of course, the module definition, all the different XML elements of that. The two big things, or the main thing I wanted to tell everybody is there's the two control types, the view and the edit. I sort of discussed this as I was talking about them. And again, the settings is a special type of edit. So that pretty much concludes the packaging. We also talked a little bit about where the assembly gets put and the SQL files and all that stuff. Then what we did to wrap it up was we talked about how to test our packages. In the past, the only way to test the packages was to simply install it on your own, version, or install it on several other instances that you may have running on your own machines. But another good resource to know about is the extension verification service provided by DotNetNuke, evs.dotnetnuke.com. It's very simple. It's just a browse, upload your install package that was created from our build process. And then you can see here on the slide is the results that I actually did. It basically just gives you a rehash of what's basically in your manifest, but it'll also tell you about the errors and warnings. You might be missing an assembly dependency or something like that. Typically, you will have errors. One of the most common errors that I've come across in my packages, as long as you use the build process, it usually should work pretty well. But it's also testing to see if you're supporting Azure, the Windows Azure, or actually for the most part SQL Azure. And one of the most common problems I've seen in my scripts is when I export my scripts, my database scripts, and it has like a create table statement with something that has like a with primary or something designated kind of a file system in SQL Server, and Azure really doesn't like that. So as long as you're careful to like strip out some of those type of file systems type commands that you'll export as part of your scripts, just don't include those. It should work just fine. So that wraps up my module development training session. And I just wanted to say again, thanks to the sponsors and for the organizers of the Southern Fried DNN event. It was a blast. We had a great time. A lot of people got a lot out of it. Don't forget, for those of you who are seeing this video directly on YouTube, to go to my website, DotNetNuclear.com, for all the information around this video. There's going to be a correlated blog article that has all the related files, this presentation right here in PowerPoint format, plus the project with all the source code in it. Don't forget to check that out. Also, it is in my Code for Cash program, so if it is of use for you and it was a benefit to your training, then please contribute by clicking on the PayPal thing at the bottom. And again, I've got a lot of training video or training material ready to make videos out of, so if you follow me on or subscribe to my channel on YouTube, follow me on Twitter, you'll get updates on when that stuff's all available. And until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you later.